Hi, and welcome back to our course on the Old Testament. I'm Kerry Muhlestein, and this is our fourth lesson of the first half of the Old Testament. Today we're talking about the story of Joseph in Egypt. And I want to remind you of everything we talked about last time in terms of learning from the narrative or the storyline, because there's a lot of storyline to learn from here in what is one of the more powerful stories, I think, in the history of the world. Just an incredible and moving and compelling story with a lot of lessons to learn from it. Now, as we do so, we're going to try and set just a little bit of historical background and ask this story: when and where does the Joseph story take place? And of course, we know it's where is kind of the basic area, but we're going to talk about especially what's happening in Egypt. So I'm going to put forth a proposal and explain it a little bit. We don't know for sure that this is what happens, or that this is the right time period, but this seems to be the right time period. In Egypt, there's a period where a group of people called the Hyksos rule in Egypt. That's from an Egyptian, a couple of words, chekasut, which means foreign rulers. So what happens is that there is Egypt is a centralized country controlled by a powerful centralized government that spans up and down the Nile and along that Nile Delta that you can see. All right, so the delta is this area where it branches out into a whole bunch of different branches of the Nile to go into the Mediterranean Sea. So that's called Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is here. The Nile flows from up to down this way. And it's controlled by a strong centralized government. But after a long time, it starts to fragment. And you don't have that strong centralized leader, but instead different areas have people rise up in them, and they control their part of Egypt, and they kind of figure themselves and style themselves as a king of Egypt. Well, in the meantime, something has been happening this whole portion of Egyptian history, what is known as the Middle Kingdom, which is this long period of centralized government, and that is that there's a group of people probably from the kind of Syria area, so even just a little bit north of here, and maybe some Phoenicians and so on, that set up a port in a big bay on this most northeastern part of the Nile, an area called Avaris. All right, and they set up a port there, and it seems to be a trading port, but over time it grows and grows and grows until just about the time that Egypt is fragmenting. It's become huge. It's a huge and economically very powerful city. And they've been living there for generations, so they've become very Egyptianized. They're Semitic people, but they've become very Egyptianized. And as Egypt starts to fragment, initially they just take over that area where they are as kings of Egypt, and they call themselves kings of Egypt and stylize themselves in an Egyptian way and so on. And then eventually they will take over the entire country, and for a short period of time, they will rule all of Egypt as Egyptian kings, but they're actually Semitic. Now, I don't know, but I think there's a decent chance that is who is king as we read the Joseph story. And in fact, the Joseph story may account for part of how they take over all of Egypt. It's very interesting because archaeologically and as we look at texts, while the Egyptians will talk about this being a military takeover, it seems more complex than that. There are some military elements, but it seems like in many ways it's economic and social takeover. Well, think of the Joseph story where, and we'll get to this more detail later, but where you have a period of time where it says the Egyptians are selling their land to the king for food. If this were a traditional king of Egypt, he really, in theory, controls all the land anyway. Of course, there are wealthy people, and they'd have to barter for that. But this may actually be describing Egyptians selling their land to a foreign ruler, a foreign king, a Hyksos king, and it's part of how he becomes king of all of Egypt. I don't know that that's what's happening, but I think that there's a good chance that's the case. And it'll explain some other little oddities in the story, including, you remember that Joseph marries the daughter of the priest of On. You can see On down here, modern-day Heliopolis, where Ra it's the cult center for Ra. And Ra is the sun god. It's one of the most important religious positions in the land. It would not be uncommon for the king to have a close relative in that position, in which case, if Joseph is marrying that person's daughter, he's marrying a Semitic woman, probably from the same area of Haran that his father and grandfather had found wives from, and that his great-great-grandfather was from, and so on, right? The areas so that you could say his mother, his grandmother, and his great-grandmother were all from these areas, right? So I think that's a reasonable possibility. In any case, we don't know if that's where it's happening, but it certainly is happening. So let's ask what we can learn from the story. And to do that, we're just going to kind of go through the story. Sometimes I'll read, and sometimes I'll just allude to that story. So we know in some ways the story starts out that Rachel has passed on, but because Joseph is Rachel's son that she had waited so long for, and because Rachel was the wife, I'm sure Jacob loved all his wives and took good care and was nice to all of them, but let's remember he fell head over heels in love with Rachel, and there was that special kind of thing that just can't be duplicated, right? And so there was a special place in his heart for Joseph and for Benjamin, especially after Rachel died, and this is all he had left of his beloved sweetheart. And so Joseph is favored after Rachel's death, and he gets this coat of many colors. There's a lot of interesting kind of traditions and stories about what that is, but in any case, it's a coat, and it's probably not really many colors, just maybe, long sleeves, or we don't know exactly what that word means that is translated as many colors, but there's something about it that sets it apart as different and significant. This is a way of saying, and really that Joseph is the favored son and probably going to be the birthright son and so on, and it makes his brothers jealous. To make matters worse, Joseph has dreams, and God communicates with him frequently through dreams, and he can understand what God means by those dreams. And some of those are talking about him being the ruler of everyone else, including his parents. And I'm going to assume Joseph was inspired to share those things. If not, he's a young guy at this time. Maybe he's just not that wise yet because this doesn't go over very well. And even his father is shocked by it. But then he kind of takes it in stride. But even his father is shocked, and his brothers are incensed by Joseph saying, I'm having dreams from God that I'm going to be in charge of all of you, right? And I think that's how they interpret it. Now, let's us remember the real definition of leadership is service, but I think it's being interpreted by them because they're in the world just like we are, as being in charge. So this doesn't go over very well, and they want to get rid of Joseph. So we know the story that all the other brothers, 10 of them, are out tending the flocks, and Joseph is sent to see how they are, and they're tired of him, so they decide, first of all, they're thinking that they might kill him. Then they decide that they will sell him. You have Reuben. It's clear Reuben was trying to forestall that. He says, let's throw him in the pit, and he seems to be planning to come back later and rescue him, but it's too late by that time. Judah is the one who comes up with the idea of selling him. Maybe that's just because Judah hated him so much and wanted to get rid of him. And maybe that's actually Judah also saying, okay, let's not kill him. Maybe I can save his life if we at least sell him. I don't know. But in any case, he's sold, and they bring back this torn coat that they've soaked in blood to their father, who is devastated by the loss of Joseph. So we know that story well. We also learn from the book of Abraham that part of the coat was preserved, and that became a prophecy about part of Joseph's seed being preserved. But in any case, that's part of the story. And then suddenly the story is interrupted with a really odd story. And that's the story of Judah and Tamar. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it placed there in the middle of that story? And let's explore the story and also explore why it's placed there. So let's go through the story. Judah has 3 sons, and one of them marries a Canaanite woman named Tamar. And then this son dies before she has children. So let's go back to that idea of the birthright child and the obligations of taking care of people. When someone marries and then the husband dies before they have children, it's very important that that line not die out. And it's also very important to take care of the widow. And so the family is obligated, and typically this would be the oldest brother or the birthright child would be involved in a marriage that's called the levirate law of marriage. It comes from a word, levir, that means brother-in-law. But anyway, where the wife, the widow, becomes the wife of the oldest surviving brother or the birthright brother. Not a typical wife, but the brother is going to take care of her the way you would a wife, and the brother is obligated to have relations with that wife so that a son or however many children it takes, but ideally a son will be born to carry on the family line, the family name. And the inheritance of that brother will go to that child, and he will not be the child of the levirate married brother, but of the original dead brother. He'll be considered his brother, even though genetically he's descended from the brother-in-law. He's considered the son of the original husband. All right, that's the levirate law. And it's the obligation of the family to take care of the widow in that way, and it's the obligation of the family to raise up children to that dead son. So Judah says, okay, we'll do this, and he sends his next oldest son in as a levirate husband, but his son does not want to have to take care of any children, and doesn't want to have I don't know if he has children yet or not, but he doesn't want to have to split that inheritance with what will be his children. So he decides he's not going to impregnate Tamar. So he goes through the pleasurable act, but isn't willing to take on the obligation. So the text says he spilled his seed on the ground, and as a result, God was displeased with this, and he died. And so now Judah is left thinking, this woman is dangerous. I'm not so sure I want to send in my third and only surviving son to her. So he tells her he's too young, let's wait, and it would seem his intent is that it will never happen. Well, after years, Tamar realizes that she's been discarded and forgotten, and she's not being taken care of. But she also recognizes that she has an obligation to provide seed for her dead husband, and also that will take care of herself, and that it is Judah's obligation either to do that himself or with his son. And when she recognizes that he's never going to do this, she takes matters into her own hands. So we have, again, someone who is providing the nudge, as it were. This is a pretty forceful nudge, but taking matters into her own hand to make things happen the way they're supposed to. So Tamar puts a veil on, and she knows Judah's coming to a certain area. She puts a veil on and dresses as if she's a harlot. And Judah comes along, and he decides, and his wife has died, if I remember the story correctly, but Judah comes along and sees her and decides that he would like to sleep with this harlot. She's not really a harlot, but he thinks she is. And she says, well, you need to pay me. And he says, well, I don't have the payment with me. I'll send it. And she says, then give me, basically collateral, something that I can be sure you will pay me. And so he gives a staff and some signet rings that are unmistakably his, and he sleeps with her, and then she takes off, and when he sends back the payment, they can't find her, and so it's too late. You can't pay her, and she has the signet ring. Well, Tamar does get pregnant from this. And when Judah hears that she's pregnant, he's incensed, and he thinks, oh, she's played the harlot. You can see the double standard here, and that's part of what's going on with this story, I think. But there is a double standard, and he says we should kill her because of this. And when they bring her out, she says, okay, but I want you to know who the father is, and she produces Judah's signet ring, and Judah is able to look himself in the mirror and say, okay, yeah, I blew it. I was supposed to provide a child either by me or my son, and we weren't, so she has forced us to do what we were supposed to do anyway, and he blesses her, and everything is okay. Now, there are a couple of things to consider here. First of all, let's consider that Christ will be descended from this union. And that may seem odd to you, but there's some important symbolism. Remember that the purpose of the levirate law of marriage is twofold: to take care of someone who isn't in a position to take care of themselves, and to make sure that the opportunity for increase, for life, continues. For eternal increase, or life will continue. Well, that's what Christ does for us. He takes care of us in ways we cannot take care of ourselves, and he provides life and the opportunity for continued life when it doesn't seem like it's possible any longer. And so the symbolism of this story is powerful in pointing towards Christ. But I think it's also placed here because Judah serves as the literary term would be, as a foil or a contrast for Joseph. We're going to see Joseph, who is virtuous and does things the right way, contrasted with Judah, who isn't initially, but learns. And one of the things I want to see in this overall story, the overall arc of the story, is that Judah actually, the rehabilitation, or we could say redemption of Judah. We're going to look for that, all right? And in some ways it may begin with this, as he has to look himself in the mirror and say, I blew this. I find this story really interesting also because Judah and Tamar are involved in the same act. And technically, neither one of them is breaking the law of chastity. And because this is a marriage or a union that is supposed to happen under the levirate law of marriage. Tamar knows that, and so her intent is also to keep the law of chastity. Judah does not know that, so his intent is not to keep the law of chastity. So I would say, while they're engaged in the same act and technically they're keeping the law, I would say Judah, I mean, I'm not really the judge, but in my understanding, Judah's probably guilty of breaking the law of chastity here because that was his intent, right? That's an interesting thing to examine as well. In any case, there's a real contrast between Joseph and Judah, and the tension between Joseph and Judah we've seen it in this story already as there's been this tension, and then they sell Joseph. We're going to see that tension last throughout the rest of the Old Testament. There's a tension between Joseph's descendants and Judah's descendants. They're both promised leadership blessings or birthright blessings, and they both fulfill that in some ways. They both have important roles to play. They split, as we'll see later, and then there are all sorts of prophecies about them coming back together. So this story is important in a number of ways. So now let's get back to the Joseph story and ask, what can we learn from Joseph? And let's ask this question also. How many times did things go badly for Joseph? How many times did they go wrong? So let's think about this. Joseph is, I mean, maybe not incredibly wise, but as I said, maybe he's inspired in sharing the blessings or the dreams with his brothers, but he's done nothing wrong. He's only doing what he should do all the time. And because of that, and because of the blessings he's receiving for that, his brothers sell him. I think we underestimate how difficult that is. We'll read this verse later, but there is a verse where later his brothers talk about the anguish of his soul as he pled with us. Now think about that. Can you imagine being betrayed by your brothers and being sold as a slave by your own family? Can you imagine how that must feel and how difficult that was for Joseph? This is a hard thing. And he goes down into Egypt, and as we all know the story, he's sold to an officer named Potiphar, and the word that's used for him, officer, it's translated as officer, is also a word that Saris, it could be translated as eunuch. This is a castrated male, and so that may be part of the dynamics behind this story, but in any case, he's a powerful person in court, and Joseph serves him, and because Joseph serves him and serves the Lord so well, everything Joseph does goes right. And he's trying to be obedient, and things prosper, and so he's given more and more power and so on. But it turns out Joseph seems to be descended from Rebekah and Sarah, and so he's a super handsome guy, I guess. And in we learned that Potiphar's wife falls in love with him. There's actually a fun story in it's not in the Quran, but it's some of the traditions attached to the Quran. There's a fun story that Potiphar's wife, some of her friends are making fun of her for falling in love with the Hebrew servant. And so she, just to teach them how handsome he is and kind of get back at them, she invites them all over for a lunch, and she gives them apples, and she's serving them apples it gives each of them really, really, really sharp knives. And at the moment that they're cutting the apple, she has Joseph walk in, and he's so good looking that every single one of them slips and cuts their hands with the knife because they're so taken aback by Joseph. I'm sure that story is not true, but you get the idea. There's a tradition that she's just head over heels for him because he is so handsome. And she wants to sleep with him, and we get really powerful things like when she just keeps insisting and he keeps trying to get away, and eventually we get in chapter 39, verse 9, where Joseph says, "There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he," meaning her husband, "kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then," and listen to what he says, "can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So clearly he doesn't want to sin against Potiphar, but he knows that in the end this is really about his relationship with God, and he does not want to sin against God. And she keeps trying to get him to lie with her, so she catches his garment in verse 12, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and got him out. What a great lesson. When the temptation is there, he flees. He has nothing to do with this. He just flees and gets out. And so she accuses him, and he's put in prison. All right, so let's ask ourselves this question. Is Joseph punished for obedience? It would certainly seem so initially. It would certainly seem that every time he does things right, it goes well for a while, and then he's punished for the very act of doing things right. And in this case, that's clearly what happens. Because he will not sin, he's put in prison. It's a terrible thing. This is what President Ezra Taft Benson said. When we put God first, this is another way of saying letting him prevail in our lives more than anything else, all other things fall into their proper place or drop out of our lives. Our love of the Lord will govern the claims of our affection, the demands on our time, the interests we pursue, and the order of our priorities. We should put God ahead of everyone else in our lives. When Joseph was in Egypt, what came first in his life? God, his job, or Potiphar's wife? Joseph was put in prison because he put God first. If we were faced with a similar choice, where would we place our first loyalty? Can we put God ahead of security, peace, passions, wealth, and the honors of men? When Joseph was forced to choose, he was more anxious to please God than to please his employer's wife. When we are required to choose, are we more anxious to please God than our boss, our teacher, our neighbor, or our date? Powerful questions, aren't they? This is from Elder Maxwell. Joseph's spiritual strength could not be shaken by things from outside. Bad breaks, therefore, need not break a good man. They may, with God's help, even make him better. And that's exactly what happens with Joseph. We know the story. He's thrown in prison, so he just keeps getting himself in a good place and put back in a bad place, but he will continue to serve God, and he becomes someone who is in charge in prison and everything prospers under his hand. That may seem odd to you. How do things prosper when you're all just locked up? But we know that at least many Egyptian prisons are things like mines or something like that. They're work camps. It's not just a prison where you sit there. They're work camps. And so this isn't easy for Joseph, but because he honors God and serves God, God makes it so that he's blessed and everything he puts his hand to prospers. And in the prison, they recognize this and so on. And then we all know the story where the butler and the baker come and they have dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams, telling the butler that he will be restored and the baker that he will be killed. And that's exactly what happens. And Joseph says to the butler, "Please remember me and mention me out there." And the butler forgets. But then the Pharaoh has a dream, and the butler remembers, and he says, "I know someone who can interpret your dream." And this is the dream of the 7 cows or kine that are fat and things go really well, and then the 7 skinny cows that come and consume them. And Joseph interprets that dream and says that this represents 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine after that. And he gives them the advice. So you should save during the 7 years of plenty so you can survive the 7 years of famine. And you should get someone who would be in charge of doing that. And Pharaoh recognizes that this is the person that should do it. Maybe it's a Semitic Pharaoh, maybe not, I don't know. But in any case, he recognizes Joseph and raises him to the level of what we would probably say is the vizier, like second in charge after Pharaoh, and says, gives him this, Asenath as a wife, and he gives him all sorts of power, and Joseph starts to act on what he's supposed to, and of course is incredibly prosperous, so that he brings incredible plenty together to save Egypt. And then the years of famine come. And he has 2 children, right? Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh first and then Ephraim. Then the years of starvation come, and Egypt is doing okay because Joseph has acquired all of this food. And he acquired the land for Pharaoh as well, as we spoke about. And eventually, Jacob is also struggling in the land of Canaan, and he realizes they need to go. They've saved up their own, but not food. They have other things that they can send. And so he sends 10 of his sons, not Benjamin, he's keeping Benjamin, but he sends 10 of his sons down into Egypt because he's heard that they do have food there and they're going to barter for food. And Joseph recognizes them. So we have to ask ourselves, what are his motives in these dealings with his brothers? And I don't know the answer, but let's explore the story a little bit and see some of the more interesting elements in this story. And that help set the scene for some of the things that we can learn. So Joseph's 10 brothers come down in chapter 42. We get verse 7. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but he made himself strange unto them. So it's interesting that he doesn't immediately say, "It's my brothers," right? Or, "It's my brothers," and he's mad about it, right? We have to ask what his motives are. I don't know, but I suspect that he wants to know if they've changed. Think he has for years and years, had to ask himself what his brothers think of him. Why would they do this to him? And I think it's important for him to know, what do they think of him now? Where are they in this thing? And he will never know that if he reveals himself in a position of power. So I think he's trying, that's just my guess, he's trying to figure out where they are, what kind of men they are now, what their feelings are towards him, where he can find out in a genuine way rather than in a way where they're forced to like him because he's in a position of power. In any case, he sees them and he asks them, where did you come from? And they say, from the land of Canaan. And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew him not. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he has dreamed, right? So they are bowing down to him now. The dreams are being fulfilled. But he does this funny little game with them. Again, I'm assuming to find out where they are now and what their motives are and how they think of him. And he says, ye are spies, to see the nakedness of the land are you come? And they say unto him, nay, my lord, but to buy food have thy servants come. And then they say, we're all brothers. We have one other brother that has died and one that's left back at home, and so on. And then we get verse 14, and Joseph said unto them, that is it that I spake unto you, saying, ye are spies. Hereby ye shall be proved. By the life of Pharaoh ye shall not go forth hence, except your youngest brother come hither. Send one of you, and let him fetch your brother, and ye shall be kept in prison. All right, so he's saying, go bring that brother, then I'll know you're not making up the story. Now, he knows already that they're not making up the story. And he puts them in prison for 3 days, and then he comes to him and he says, well, let's do this a little bit differently. I'm going to send all of you back but one. I'll keep one here. And the rest, as surety, right? And the rest can go back, and then you come back and you bring that other brother. Now, I have to think some of it is he's wondering how they're treating Benjamin. Benjamin was his full brother. I think he felt a degree of responsibility for Benjamin, and all these years hasn't been able to take care of Benjamin. He wonders how they're treating him, and he'd like to see Benjamin again. So that's probably part of his motives, but also trying to figure out where his brothers are in this whole thing. And he says, bring your youngest brother back to me. Now, I want you to look at verse 21. This does tell us something. So we're in chapter 42, verse 21. This does tell us something about what Joseph went through and also where his brothers are. And they don't realize that Joseph can understand them. And they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother. Now, note that when something goes wrong, the first thing they think is, this is because of what we did to Joseph. That tells you they've had some guilt over this for a very long time. They have been feeling bad about what happened to the point where if something goes wrong, immediately, this is because of that terrible sin we did. But note also they said, we're very guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. So this gives us that little glimpse into what that scene must have been like as Joseph was being sold, and he pled with his brothers. And Reuben answered them, saying, spake I not unto you, saying, do not sin against the child, and you would not hear? Therefore, behold, also his blood is required. So Reuben is just like, it wasn't my fault, but I still think this is happening because of what happened, and it's your guys' fault. And they knew not that Joseph understood them, as we said. And he turned himself about from them and wept, and then returned to them again and communed with them, and took from them Simeon and bound him before their eyes. So you see, hearing their guilt creates this emotional reaction in him. He can see that at least some of what he must have hoped all these years actually did happen, and it affects him very, very deeply. But then he continues with his ruse, and he's going to keep Simeon in prison. I'm going to assume he makes it kind of a nice prison for Simeon. I don't know. But maybe Simeon had to do the same thing he did. I don't know. But they all go back, and he fills their sacks with the grain that they were buying, and he also has the money put back in, and this kind of freaks them out when they're on their way home, like, oh no, we've got problems here. This isn't going to go over well. But they come back to Jacob, and they tell him what's going on. And notice Jacob's reaction. I'm not sending Benjamin back. All right, we're going to come back to that in a minute. But his reaction is, I am not sending Benjamin back. And so Simeon stays in jail for a long time while they eat what they have until they run out of food again. And now they're on the point of starvation. All right, and Reuben initially says, I'll make sure that Benjamin comes back. I'll stand as surety for him. But Jacob is not willing. So finally, we get to where they need more food, and they tell him, we can't go back. He says, go back and get more food. And they said, we can't come back if we don't bring Benjamin with us. And Jacob says, there's no way I'm sending Benjamin. And Judah, we're in chapter 43, verse 8. Judah said unto Israel, his father, send the lad with me, meaning Benjamin, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou, and also our little ones. I will be surety for him. Of my hand shalt thou require him. If I bring him not unto thee and set him before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. Right. So he offers to be surety for him. That's an important part of this story as we go back. So Jacob says, okay, but bring double the money and a bunch of other little gifts and so on, and let's see if we can make this work out okay. So they come down, and they bring double the money and so on, and they say, sorry, we thought we paid you, but we had the money. And Joseph says, don't worry about it. And he sees Benjamin. Let's go to chapter 43, verse 26. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the present which was in their hand into the house, and bowed themselves to him in the earth. And he asked them of their welfare, and said, is your father well, the old man of whom you spake? Is he yet alive? Now, no, I mean, they're just thinking, yeah, he's making pleasant talk. This is Joseph's dad. Basically, he's asking, how's dad? I haven't seen him for like 20 years. How is dad? Is he doing okay? We'll come back to that in a minute. And they answer and say, it's okay. And verse 29, and he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, is this your younger brother? It's been so long he can't recognize him. But he's been looking for him, I would guess, and assuming this is him. Is this your younger brother of whom you spake unto me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. And Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber and wept there. Oh, the power of the emotion of what they're going through is so incredible. It really is. Then he washes his face, and he comes out, and he has dinner for them, and he sets them all in age order, and they're amazed that they would know age order, and he gives Benjamin twice as much, and so on, and the brothers are scratching their heads at all of this. Then he tells them to go off, and he puts the money in their sacks' mouths, but he also puts his special silver cup, and he has it put in Benjamin's sack. And then he has people chase after them and say, you stole from me. And they all say, nope, we did not steal from you. We're sure we did not steal from you. If you open all our sacks, and if you find someone stole from you, then have that guy. Not knowing that Joseph has planned this all out. And so they open it up, and they find that it's in Benjamin's sack. We're in chapter 44, verse 12. And he searched and began at the eldest and left at the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they rent their clothes and laid every man his ass and returned to the city. So they could have just let Benjamin go. Say, okay, well, that's the end of Benjamin, and go home with their stuff. This is an important thing to recognize the change here, okay? And we're going to hit it just a little bit more as we get to Judah. But think of that. They could have left Benjamin behind and gone home. And they come to Joseph's house, for he's yet there, and they fell before him on the ground. And Joseph said to them, what deed is this that you've done? And don't you know I can divine? Don't you know I can tell what's happened? And they said, keep us and send Benjamin home. And verse 17, and he said, God forbid that I should do so, but the man in whose hand the cup is found, he shall be my servant. And as for you, get you up in peace to your father. Now we get to the heart of the story, really. Then Judah came near unto him and said, O my Lord, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ear, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servants, saying, have ye a father or a brother? And we said unto my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, a little one, and his brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother, and his father loveth him. And thou saidst unto thy servant, bring him down unto me, that I may set mine eyes upon him. And we said unto my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. And thou saidst unto thy servants, except your younger brother come down with you, ye shall see my face no more. And it came to pass, when we came up unto thy servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord, and our father said, go again and buy us a little food. And we said, we cannot go down hither, except our younger brother come with us. And he talks about how Jacob didn't want to do that, and how he misses Joseph. Now let's skip down to verse 29. And if you take this, meaning Benjamin, also from me, and mischief befall him, ye shall bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, so this is Judah speaking to Joseph again. Now therefore, when I come to thy servant my father, and the lad be not with us, seeing that his life is bound up in the lad's life. This phrase there is, seeing that his soul is knit in the boy's soul, it shall come to pass, when he seeth that the lad is not with us, that he will die, and thy servant shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For thy servant, meaning Judah, became surety for the lad unto my father, saying, if I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father. Now therefore, I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren. For how shall I go up to my father, and the lad be not with me, lest peradventure I see the evil that shall come on my father? And note Joseph's reaction. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before them that stood by him. All right, so we'll finish with that in a minute. But Joseph has seen something. He's seen a change. So I want you to put yourself in Judah's place, or all of the brothers' place. Remember that what they hated about Joseph was how favored he was by Jacob. And it's clear that Benjamin has taken that place. So much so that basically Jacob has said, I would rather let Simeon rot in jail and never see Simeon again than send Benjamin down and take the chance that I don't see him again. Right? It is so clear that Benjamin has taken that place. If these were the same people who were willing to kill or sell Joseph because of that jealousy, they've just been handed their opportunity on a silver platter. They can go back to Jacob and say, we did everything we could. He stole from this guy. He's so crazy. He stole from this guy. It's not our fault. And they're rid of Benjamin through no fault of their own, no guilt. It's just gone. But they're not willing to do that. At least probably partially because they love Benjamin, or they've grown to not be so jealous at least. But I would guess partially because they saw what it did to their father. And I think they love Jacob. And they saw what it did to their father when he thought that Joseph had died, and they could not do that again. These are changed men. And so you think of Judah, who is saying to Joseph, keep me, even if it was that Benjamin did these terrible things. And even though Benjamin has clearly become the favored son, I would rather stay the rest of my life in prison than not send him back to our father. That's a changed Judah. That's a different Judah than the one who sold Joseph, a very different Judah. Now, we'll return to the story in a moment, but I also want you to stop and think about how Judah is serving as a symbol or a shadow or a type of Christ here. So pause for a minute and think about that. How is Judah serving as a symbol or a type of Christ? All right, I don't know what you thought of, and you probably thought of some things I didn't, and I maybe thought of some things that you didn't, but I want you to think about this. Let's reframe the story in this way. Judah promised his father that he would bring his child back to him. And he went down into Egypt or into the world and found that circumstances happened that would make it so that the child couldn't come back. But he said, I promised my father I would bring this son home. And if it means I have to sacrifice myself, I will do it because I am bringing him back to my father. That is what Christ has done for all of us. He has promised his Father that he would bring us back to him, and it means sacrificing himself. And he is willing to do it so that we can go back to our Father. It's not a coincidence that Christ is descended from Judah and Tamar and from Judah, who serves here as a symbol or a type of Christ. Now, back to our story. Joseph, when he sees that they are changed, that they are different, and I think we should think of what's going on with these brothers as they're toyed with in a way, and they go through all of these emotions, and it's so difficult, including that interlude moment where we have Simeon. Oh, it's not a moment, it's a long time. Simeon is in prison, and the way this must tug on all of these brothers' feelings. I mean, Simeon probably has children and a wife, and what's going on with them, right? And so on. We've already talked about, so we're going to skip that part. Oh, sorry. All right. So it's good to think about what's going on with these brothers, but let's also think about what's going on with Joseph and what we can learn from Joseph here. So note that as we get back to the beginning of chapter 45, then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, cause every man to go out for me. And there stood no man with him while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Now, I want you to put yourself in those shoes, in their shoes. Can you imagine the absolute fear? Here's the second most powerful man in the entire world, and he says, I'm Joseph. And you have to think, uh-oh, we're in trouble. But note Joseph's next question. Doth my father yet live? He already knows the answer to that question. He asked him that question. He's got the answer. To me, this signifies how much the separation from Jacob has been difficult for Joseph. That when he can be himself, he's already asked about Jacob, but when he can be himself, he has to ask again. This is what weighs on his heart so heavily, is this separation from Jacob. And now he has to hear from his brothers, as they know that this is their brother. Tell me how Dad is. Tell me what's going on with Dad. It just is a little glimpse into the weight that's been on Joseph's heart. And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. I would guess that they were. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now listen, here is just such an incredible perspective. This is something we can learn from this story. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves. Note the forgiveness and the perspective, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall be neither earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. And then he tells him, go get Dad and bring him home. But I want you to see that perspective. So first of all, how incredibly forgiving he is. He could have lowered the boom on these guys, right? This could have gone really poorly. He is not interested in that. Now you'll note his brothers are nervous about this enough that when Jacob dies, they again come to Joseph and they say, oh, Dad said don't kill us, right? So they may think that he's just taking it easy on them because he doesn't want to cause Jacob pain, but when Jacob's dead, they're still nervous. So they're still struggling with this, but Joseph seems to have completely forgiven them. And he does say at that same time, no, it was God who sent me. Quit worrying about this, right? So he has forgiven them. I think he wanted to know who they were really, and if they changed, that satisfies his soul in a way that allows him to have a different relationship with them than if he doesn't know that. But he has forgiven them, and he has this incredible perspective on his trials. And he says, all of this happened. All of the terrible things that happened to me happened because God was putting me where I needed to be to do his will and to save people, especially to save the house of Israel. That's an incredible perspective. If we can gain that perspective, oh, how it will help us. That's a really, really powerful thing. Then, as we know, Jacob comes down, and what a reunion as Joseph falls on him, and they weep together, and what an incredible reunion, and it has to make me think of the reunion that we will one day have with our Father in heaven when we're able to be with him again. And Joseph takes care of his family, and Jacob blesses all of Israel, including Ephraim and Manasseh, and he, even though Ephraim is not the older one, he gives Ephraim the birthright blessing, though Manasseh gets a very similar blessing, and we've already talked about birthright and leadership, and so I hope we'll understand that. All of the tribes have incredible blessings. I've written about that and the great blessings that each tribe has. Judah and Joseph in particular are given leadership blessings, and Ephraim and Manasseh are both going to inherit those leadership blessings. They seem to be the same blessings, just in terms of number of seed and things like that. Ephraim will have more, and they'll both be leaders, servant leaders, right? But leaders in gathering Israel. But Ephraim will lead first, and then Manasseh, and then everyone will work in that gathering of Israel and gathering all the world in. So these blessings are all incredible and important. So many powerful things from this story. One powerful thing I think we should investigate is how this story teaches us about Christ. All right, how does it serve as a symbol of Christ? We want to really make sure we're drawing closer to the Father through his Son, Jesus Christ, and understanding Christ so we can increase that relationship we've talked about. And it teaches us some things about the latter days and this gathering of Israel as well. But let's look at specifically how Joseph serves as a symbol or a type of Christ, all right? So Joseph was the most loved of his father, and Christ was loved of the Father, right? And we know that Joseph was obedient to his father, and when his father wanted to send him to do something, he said, here am I. And Christ was fully obedient to his father, and he also responded with, here am I, when God needed to send someone. Joseph was promised he would become a great ruler, and Christ was promised that he would be a great ruler. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers and stripped of his garments, and Christ was betrayed by one whom he called a brother and was stripped of his garments. Joseph was sold by Judah for 20 pieces of silver, which was the going price of a slave in those days. And Christ was sold by Judas, which is Greek for Judah, for 30 pieces of silver, which was apparently the going price for a slave in those days. Joseph was tempted with a great sin, but refused, and Christ was tempted with a great sin, but also refused. Joseph was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and Christ was falsely accused before the Sanhedrin. Joseph was 30 years old when he began his life's work, and Christ was 30 years old when he began his life's work. Joseph saved his family from destruction, and Christ saves the family of mankind from death and hell or destruction. Joseph gathered an estranged house of Israel to him, and Christ will gather an estranged house of Israel to the Father. Joseph could have punished his tormentors, but instead forgave him, and Christ could have punished, but instead forgave those who crucified him. Joseph served in prison, then was elevated to the Egyptian king's second in command, and Christ taught while in spirit prison, and then was elevated to God's right hand. Joseph had people from many nations bow before him, and all people will bow before Christ. Jacob sent his son Benjamin, whom he loved, and in return had Joseph, who was as dead to him, restored to him. And God sent his beloved son, and in return has restored to him his children who were captive to death. Joseph suffered greatly from being separated from his father, and Christ suffered greatly from being separated from his father. After his trials were over, Joseph was reunited with his father, and after his trials were over, Christ was reunited with his Father and makes it so that we can all be reunited with our Father. Joseph gave his family an inheritance, and Christ gives us an inheritance with God. Those are just, I'm sure there are other things you can think of that we learn about Christ as we look at this story. And I hope also lessons you can learn in perseverance through trial and in keeping a larger and God-centered perspective on that, and on being grateful for God for what he does, even through the difficulties, and on forgiving, and so on and so on. There are so many things that we can learn from this story, but most of all, I hope it helps us come closer to Christ.